This is a story of who we were, how we got here.
Houston, the Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility, we copy.
And where we are going.
You've got mail.
So join us as we take history off the page.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of History Off the Page. Of course, I'm your host, Dr. Jason Hansen, and in today's episode, we're going to be talking about the rise of the Nazi Party. Now, of course, when we talk about origin stories, we're going to cover the major events that happened, we're going to talk about Hitler, we're going to talk about some of the organizations that are formed. But as those of you who've listened to the podcast for a while know, what I really like to get into is not so much the what or the when, but especially the questions of how and why. So how is it that the Nazi Party, which in the early summer of 1919 is about 50 to 100 people, they're basically a bunch of sort of historical losers in some ways. They're working the Munich lecture circuit, but they're not very popular. They're not very important. Nobody really seems to care about them. How did they go from just this kind of small group to a party of tens of thousands of people by the time you get to 1923? How do they get to be a mass movement that people are like, oh my goodness, they could actually take control of at least Bavaria, maybe Germany itself? So while we're talking here about the origins of the Nazi Party, we're also simultaneously talking about the historical evolution of a political party. We're talking about the very nature of politics and political movements themselves. Now, there is far more to this story, by the way, than just the idea that, well, Adolf Hitler was a really good speaker. Right? A lot of times when you see kind of generalizations, sort of short answers, the Wikipedia version of, well, how is it that the Nazis grew? We say, oh, well, Hitler was a great speaker. He persuaded everybody. He brainwashed everybody. And there is some truth to this. Hitler being a really good public speaker is a key part of the story. And we're going to go into why he was such a good public speaker, in addition to just kind of stating the fact that, well, okay, he was one. But there is more to the story than just Hitler speaking. Adolf Hitler is not the only gifted orator in Munich, in Bavaria, in 1919, 1920, 1921. There are plenty of other people, including people that are on the sort of nationalist right, who are very good public speakers. Why don't they build a mass movement? So one of the things we want to do today is to again answer that question of why and to unpack how the Nazis are able to pull this off. The second thing to note before we really get started, of course, is that we're not just talking about the rise of the Nazi Party in a sort of linear fashion, in a sort of teleological, they start and they just keep winning, winning, winning. Of course, as many of you know, in November 1923, Hitler does try to overthrow the government. He fails. And yet, 1923 is not the end of his story. The Nazi Party is briefly banned. And yet, it's not the end of their story. As we know, unfortunately, tragically, all too well, the Nazis come back. They eventually seize power. So why didn't Hitler die, politically speaking, in 1923? Why didn't the Nazi Party just become a kind of footnote in history to be replaced by some other right-wing nationalist group? What we're talking about today is not just the rise of the Nazi Party, but it is also the failure of the Weimar Republic to stop the Nazi advance, to stop the rise of authoritarianism. So today's episode is about the past, but it may also have lessons for the present or perhaps for the future. So again, we're going to get into all this stuff and more in today's episode. Before we start, it's worth noting that this is the third episode now in our series on Nazi Germany. If you haven't heard the previous episodes, you might want to go back and listen to those first. You don't have to. You could just listen to this as a standalone. If you're interested in our other episodes, we have several on Israel-Palestine. We have episodes on things like the Russian Revolution. We have things on cultural events as well. The fin de siècle is one of my favorite. You can find information about all our episodes on our website, www.historyoffthepage.com. You can also find some reading recommendations there, including about Hitler, including about the rise of the Nazi Party. And the last thing I'll say before we really get started is we also, of course, have our Patreon-only episodes. We have already posted one called The Making of Hitler, which gets into the origins of his anti-Semitism, his political beliefs, talks about Vienna. We kind of dismiss some of the myths that are out there about him. And then hopefully by the end of July, we'll have Nazism and the occult ready. So those of you that are into kind of like crazy Norse runes and where did the swastika come from and who are these guys that think they can levitate, it's kind of an interesting episode. There's a lot of craziness going on, but hopefully that'll be ready by the end of July. And you can access those episodes by becoming a Patreon member for as little as $2 a month. And if you're not sure how to join Patreon, again, you can go to my website or you can just Google it. Okay, let's get into the actual history. The piece of music that I played at the beginning of the podcast was called the Horst Wessel Lied, or Raise the Flag High was its kind of initial title. It was written in 1929 by a Nazi stormtrooper named Horst Wessel. Now, Wessel was basically like many young men growing up in the kind of wake of World War I. We sort of talked about this already, that many of the people that become early Nazis are people that were too young to fight in World War I, but were old enough to kind of understand and remember it. So when World War I ends, Horst Wessel was 11, right? Horst Wessel was too young to go to the front, was too young to fight, but he was clearly aware of the things going on around him, and he felt very passionately about it. And so Germany is full of such men in 1919, 1920, really into the 1920s and even to the 30s. And these men kind of float around sometimes. Horst Wessel is one. He'll join a number of right-wing organizations. But eventually he joins the Nazi Party and he becomes a district commander of what's called the Sturmabteilung, or the SA. The SA is the kind of Nazi paramilitary force that we'll talk about a lot in today's episode. Now, like many members of the SA during the Great Depression, Wessel is frequently involved in these kind of street battles with communist militias, with social democratic militias. Right, we have formal politics, we have voting, we have electoral campaigns, but those only happen in certain moments. Right, and so what do you do? How do you carry on the struggle when it's not election day? The parliament, basically, in Weimar, Germany at this point is not really doing a whole lot, functionally speaking. And so for many people, the answer is you just go out and you fight the fight on the streets of Berlin, on the streets of Munich, on the streets of Frankfurt. And so Wessel is kind of a brawler. He's kind of good at it. He's kind of good at organization. And so as he's become this district commander and he's thinking about these battles with the communists, he thinks to himself, hey, we need a song to kind of inspire us, to rally around. And the communists, of course, have lots of songs. And so he kind of steals their idea in some ways. And he writes this kind of song again called Raise the Flag High. Now, in 1930, Wessel basically gets shot. There is a dispute going on about his kind of the place he's renting. There's a question of whether or not perhaps he was bringing prostitutes into there, whether he was not paying the rent. And so basically the woman who owned the apartment or who was collecting the rent, she basically gets a couple communist guys to kill him, kind of turns him over to them, kind of like rats him out, if you will. So they knock on his door one day and just shoot him. Now, Wessel doesn't die immediately. He kind of lingers and then dies from sepsis. And in many ways, one can say this sort of tragic story is hardly exceptional again for many young men who are living through the era of the Great Depression. Now, of course, most of them don't die, but when you get into this kind of gangster-type lifestyle, you're fighting on the streets all the time, you're making enemies, Right? Where does one draw the line about what's sort of legitimate and illegitimate? Right? Is it okay for me to go and like destroy someone's shop? Is it okay for me to beat them up with maybe a baton or brass knuckles or something like that? Is a knife okay, but a gun isn't? And so again, in many ways, Wessel is hardly exceptional. But his story soon becomes exceptional because of the efforts of a crafty Nazi leader who happens to be in charge of Berlin, and his name, of course, is Joseph Goebbels. Now, under Goebbels' watchful eye, the Wessel story is basically transformed into the ultimate example of Nazi martyrdom. In fact, the song becomes so popular that it gets elevated to being the kind of official anthem of the Nazi Party. The name gets changed from Raise the Flag High, which sounds kind of like, boring, to the Horst Wessel Lied. Right? They're going to name it after him. They're going to celebrate him. They're going to commemorate his death. What a martyr for the cause. After the Nazis seized power in 1933, the Horst Wessel Lied becomes the sort of unofficial anthem of Nazi Germany. Right? So it's more a song about the Nazi Party, but they use it in official ways. They use it to represent Germany. And that's pretty incredible if you think about it. Now, the song itself is pretty basic. If you go online, you can see a translation of it, but it's basically just these 3 short stanzas, and they reflect many of the ideals of the Nazi Party. Its song is, as you might expect, it's very militant. It celebrates violence. It celebrates the theme of sacrifice for the nation. The words talk about kind of closing up ranks, talks about honoring the comrades shot by the Red Front, talks about the call to arms being sounded, and notes that, quote, millions are looking upon the swastika full of hope, end quote. And finally, if you compare it to kind of 19th century nationalist songs, it seems very familiar, right? These songs often end with this kind of exaggerated notion of glory, this idea that what we're doing here is some kind of incredible moment, incredible fate. So the second stanza talks about how the day of freedom and bread dawns. The third stanza claims that, quote, the time of bondage will last but a little while now, end quote. Now, I'm going into a lot of detail about this song because it's obviously a kind of good place to start talking about what the Nazi Party is, because, of course, the song talks about so many of the values that the Nazi Party had. As I just mentioned, it's all about militancy. It's all about violence. It's all about community. But there's a second reason that I feel it's such a good place to start our episode today. And that's basically because it highlights the way that Nazis use culture to win followers. To put this kind of differently, Nazism is not just a political movement. Right? Hitler will give speeches. There is a kind of ideology to it. There are core planks about nationalism and racism and violence. Ultimately, fascism, you could say, is part of it. But the way that Nazism really appeals to most people is very different, one could say, than the way that communism appeals to people. Right? There are not, as we talked about with Mussolini, there's not a lot of emphasis on the ideological planks like, here's an intellectual, go read Marx, go read Lenin, go read Trotsky, go read whoever. Fascism is much more about the idea of doing things than it is about words and concepts and theories. And so one of the things that we see is that it is really a social movement, that it attracts its followers in part because of its cultural power, not just because of the idea that, well, I'm joining a political party and I've got to go to the party days and the meetings and all of the kind of formal political stuff. What the Nazis do is they master, in some ways, a new or a revised version of communication. They learn how to talk to people with rituals and symbols and mythologies that are going to appeal to ordinary Germans in a way that, say, listening to a speech by Paul von Hindenburg or Wilhelm Marx, listening to someone's 5-point plan about how we're going to get out of the Depression, that stuff is boring. That stuff, if you're not someone who follows politics closely, that stuff is you don't even pay attention to it. I don't understand it. All these complicated words and theories. Some farmers may not know what a tariff is. The local cobbler or the local seamstress, the person running a little mom and pop shop, they don't necessarily know about the finer points of economic theory, like the Dawes Plan, which will come in 1924, so a little bit later. But you get the idea, right? What attracts people to Nazism in the beginning, quite a bit of it is the way that they talk to people and engage with people beyond the words and beyond the ideology. Nazism will kind of invent this sort of alternative modernity that they sort of predict you can strip out the negative elements of things like class conflict, hyperinflation. We can overcome the defeat in the war and the Great Depression. But again, a large part of it isn't just the ideas, although those are important. A lot of it is about the way that they convey these ideas to ordinary people. Right? I can talk about law and order all we want, but when I show people through force on the streets that we're not going to tolerate communist rabble anymore, that's more convincing. When we have torchlight parades that last for hours and show thousands of men marching in uniform, marching in order, creating these kind of incredible visual lines, that speaks to people in a way that just giving a speech doesn't do. So again, one could argue that it's this ability to perform their values that is such a huge part of the reason how Nazis were able to distinguish themselves from the multitude of other political alternatives that are out there in Germany in the 1920s. And so again, to kind of wrap all this up, this is part of the answer to the main question that we want to examine in today's episode. How did the Nazi Party transform itself from being a group of dilettante intellectuals who wanted to engage with the working class in Germany to a party of approximately 800,000 people by the time they eventually seized power in 1933? If you want to say, now, Dr. Hansen, we're talking about really before 1923, we're talking about up to the Beer Hall Putsch, the number is closer to 55,000. So it's not as big. It's definitely much more regional. But make no mistake, by 1923, the Nazis, at least in Bavaria, have become a key political player. So how did they pull this off? That's what we want to look at. Now, before we can really get into what the Nazi Party eventually became, we need to recognize that in the beginning, it really wasn't much. It didn't really have much going for it. As I said before, these early guys in the Nazi Party, they have some ideas. They're going into these kind of beer halls. They're giving these talks. Sometimes the crowd is for them. Sometimes the crowd is against them. But it's really very kind of like basic, very kind of juvenile, if you will, in terms of political organization. At the time of its birth in 1919, the Nazi Party, like its future leader Adolf Hitler, probably struck most contemporaries as something that was unlikely to change the course of history. Now, the beginning of the Nazi Party starts in January 1919. They're initially founded as a group called the German Workers' Party, or the DAP. And the key kind of architect, the key mind behind them is not Adolf Hitler, but it was a Bavarian machinist named Anton Drexler. And Drexler was part of this kind of crowd on the right. Again, they're meeting in the beer halls even before the end of the war. They're talking to people in various societies, various groups. One of Drexler's kind of buddies at this time is a journalist named Karl Harrer. And Harrer is basically a member of the Tool Society. We'll talk about them more in our Patreon episode on Nazism and the occult. But all these guys are kind of floating around Munich. They're there when Munich basically becomes a socialist republic under Kurt Eisner. And then he gets assassinated in February 1919. There's a bloody crackdown by some of those Freikorps. And so again, people like Drexler, people like Harrer, they're living in this environment of revolution. They're trying to think, how can we kind of do what's best for Germany? They're people that want to do something. At any rate, both men are basically active in sort of local grassroots politics. They are particularly interested in questions about the working class. Right? We don't want the working class to go over to communism. But Drexler and Harrer are actually kind of also anti-capitalist. Or at least they are against certain elements of capitalism. They are also very racist. They're very anti-Semitic. When they think about capitalism, they're not thinking necessarily in terms of class and the bourgeoisie and the ownership and things like that. They're thinking more in terms of Jews that are lending money to people and supposedly exploiting them. So in many ways, kind of when Drexler and Harrer get together to found the Nazi Party in January of 1919, their vision is that it's going to be something like a combination of the pan-Germanism of someone like Georg Ritter von Schöner with a kind of working class focus of someone like Karl Lueger. And of course, if you listen to our episode on Making Hitler, Hitler talks in Mein Kampf, so this is after the fact, but he kind of talks about the idea that what Nazism is supposed to be is a combination of the two. Right? And whether or not he had reached that in Vienna, which we're kind of skeptical about, in the post-World War I era, in Munich, when the Nazi Party is founded, that is kind of the idea behind it, right? But how are we going to actually reach out to the working classes? How are we actually going to win them over to our cause? Drexler and Harrer, basically, along with some other people like Gottfried Feder, they are going to organize these small meetings. They're going to go to beer halls. They're going to go to cellars. They're going to give talks to people, maybe a dozen, maybe 50, maybe 100 if you're lucky. And there are a lot of these people that are kind of floating around Munich in the immediate aftermath of World War I that kind of sell themselves as not so much members of a party, but they're more members of this emerging movement, right? So you know that they're more of a right-wing speaker. You know that they're sort of sympathetic to the overall nationalist cause. And so they go around and they give these talks. Now, one of the most important guys is one that I just mentioned, this guy Gottfried Feder. Feder was actually an engineer, but he kind of sold himself as being an economist. If you think about the modern media environment, you think about podcasting, how many podcasts are out there by people who are not really experts in the subjects that they're talking about? How many people have a history podcast that don't have a PhD? And that's not to knock on them. Some of them are very good. I'm just pointing out that this idea that you can kind of invent yourself as an expert without quote-unquote credentials, this is something that people in 1919 would have recognized and accepted. And so Feder is one of these people who suddenly becomes an economic expert, and he goes on and on about what he calls interest slavery. Now, Feder is, again, not purely anti-capitalist, but he kind of racializes his notion of what capitalism is to create this idea of a sort of healthy capitalism where people are lending each other money to help each other, and a kind of exploitative capital, which is supposed to be kind of led by Jews. And this is the idea that, well, we loan the farmer money in the hopes that he gets into debt. Right? If you go online, if you read people, if you listen to podcasts and they talk about the credit card companies, right? How do the credit card companies make their money? It's not that they're really helping people out that much. They're really helping bridge the gap with these, small loans. It's that they want you to spend more money than you have, and then you default on it or you make a late payment, or you can't pay off your credit card, and now we can hit you with the big interest, and that's how we're going to make our money. And so there's a long history of this in Europe and in Germany in particular, of this idea that usury, the idea that you're making money off of a loan, that this is sinful, that this is wrong. That if you want to make money, the way you ought to do it is through hard work, through labor, through producing something. The idea that you just sit around and own stuff and get money, that's not quite something that we want to laud, especially if it's not even that you just own a factory, right? Okay, that's fine. You can own a factory. You're employing people. But if you're just loaning people money and then living off of the debt that they accumulate, a lot of Germans in 1919 and before would have said there's something deeply morally problematic about that. And so especially on the kind of nationalist right, people like Federer argue that really the people doing this, it's not the bankers, it's the Jews. Now, of course, if you look at the Social Democrats, if you look at especially the communists, they're going to say, no, it's the bourgeoisie that's doing this. Right? So the ideas are the same. They just kind of identify different groups as being the ones kind of behind this exploitative capital. At any rate, again, Federer becomes a kind of early important speaker for the Nazis. In the spring of 1919, he officially joins the party. And he basically is a huge influence on its early evolution. As we'll talk about in just a moment, in 1920, the Nazi Party will actually produce a 25-point program. Some of those planks, such as number 10, that it must be the first duty of every citizen to perform physical or mental work, or point number 11, the abolition of incomes unearned by work, these are basically Gottfried Feder. Right? This is not Hitler wandering around the streets of Vienna suddenly going, Eureka, I figured out, socialism. I figured out, the political blueprint for the future. A lot of that is just not true. But Feder is, again, a key player in this early scene as basically the Nazi Party is forming. Eventually, he will run into Adolf Hitler at a kind of political training camp in the summer of 1919. And in essence, he basically becomes a key mentor for the future dictator. Now, there's one other early Nazi Party member that we should kind of mention here. Again, this sort of pre-Hitler period. This is a guy named Dietrich Eckart. Eckart was basically a playwright, but he's also somebody that's kind of a big sort of nationalist intellectual. He's got lots of contacts with people across the various sort of political parties and groups on the political right in Munich. In 1920, Eckart would become the editor of the first Nazi newspaper, the Völkischer Beobachter. And Eckart would eventually die of a heart attack in December 1923. So you tend not to hear a whole lot more about Dietrich Eckart. He tends to be left out of the bigger story of Nazism because he's just not around when they seize power. One of Eckart's kind of disciples is a guy named Alfred Rosenberg, who was a Baltic German that had come to Munich after World War I. Rosenberg becomes, in many ways, he's not Jewish, by the way, but Rosenberg becomes kind of known as the Nazi intellectual, even though he's not really that bright and his importance is kind of minor. But basically, he met Hitler through Dietrich Eckart. They all wind up in the Nazi Party. At any rate, again, the early Nazi Party is still not much to behold by the summer of 1919. They only had about 60 members at the time that Hitler winds up joining. In fact, the Nazi Party is so small and they have such a chip on their shoulders that one of the things that they do is when they give out membership cards, they don't start with member number 1. They start with member 501 so that they can look bigger. You guys know I like to make these sort of social media comparisons. It's like saying you have your social media site or you have your social media handle and you're going to create a bunch of fake profiles to follow you just to make you seem bigger, because why on earth would anyone want to follow someone with like 10 followers? Duh. If you want a more serious take on this, take Richard Evans, the noted Cambridge historian, in his 3-part series on the history of Nazi Germany. As he's describing this early Nazi party, he says, quote, "There was nothing unusual about Drexler or his tiny party in the far-right hothouse of Munich after the defeat of the revolution," end quote. Now, of course, the first major step for the Nazi Party growing is going to be the arrival of Adolf Hitler. On September 12, 1919, Hitler was actually assigned to go kind of report on the Nazi Party. Right at this point, he's working for essentially the German army. His job is to try to recruit soldiers, to try to indoctrinate soldiers, to make sure they stay loyal to the army and not kind of go over to communism. And so he's assigned to go attend this meeting. And in the middle of the meeting, this guy who's kind of like a Bavarian separatist stands up and he starts heckling the speaker. And apparently Hitler got so upset that Hitler gets up and Hitler starts, arguing with this guy. And Hitler kind of wins the argument. The guy just kind of leaves and gives up. And so afterwards, Drexler says, "Oh, wow, you seem like a guy. You seem like a good chap. You have kind of a good way of arguing with people. Would you like to join our party?" And whether Hitler decided to do this on his own or whether he was ordered to do it by Captain Karl Mayr, who was the kind of supervisor of this political division, basically Hitler decides to join the party. And of course, he then becomes an important person within it. On October 16, 1919, so about 5 weeks later, Hitler makes his first speech as a member of the Nazi Party to a gathering of just about 100 people at the Hofbraukeller in Munich. Right? So he's not a name yet. He's kind of, imagine, Jerry Seinfeld or Will Ferrell or some kind of stand-up comic, but at the very, very beginning of their career, and they go on stage and there's only like 100 people in the crowd. This is Hitler at the very beginning. Now, Hitler's impact on the young party was felt pretty quickly. And this was driven in part by his highly effective speaking style. Now, I want to spend a few moments talking about this Because when we see Hitler portrayed by either actors or even when you see clips of him in like historical documentaries, Hitler is always yelling and screaming. He's always upset. He's kind of frothing at the mouth. He seems like someone who is emotionally unstable. And we look at that and go, oh my God, how could anyone follow this guy? How could anybody want to be around him? How could anybody think that the massing power in the hands of a crazy person is a good idea? Of course, what we miss is that this is only part of the speech, that it usually begins very, very differently from that, and that it is also intentional. So if you look at the beginning of a Hitler speech, if you go online, you can find them on YouTube, you can find them sometimes in documentaries, but watch the whole thing. He doesn't start yelling and screaming at the beginning. In fact, he has this kind of very toned down, this very controlled and almost kind of boring, almost kind of anxious sort of tone to his speeches. He'll start off by saying, in a small voice, with lots of pauses, something like this. He seems quiet. He seems timid. He seems in total control of his body. And it's only over the course of the argument, as he gets to the things that matter more and more, that his tone becomes more passionate, that his voice gets louder, and that he starts shouting, and that he starts saying, I am mad as hell, and I'm not going to take it anymore. Now, obviously, I just did a little kind of parody of it, but it is this ability with his voice to change things up, to intone, to become passionate. That's what the people are responding to. Hitler starts out as someone convincing his audience, I am actually a normal person. I am actually a quiet person. I don't really want to be here in front of a giant crowd. I'm not doing this for myself.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
You know, they say teaching is the mother of all professions, but right now it feels like it's happening inside a pressure cooker. That's why we created Higher Listenings, bringing a dose of joy to the future of learning. We're exploring things like why reading may not be obsolete after all, the remarkable connection between emotion and learning, and the real reason students cheat.
It's not a moral failing. It's the circumstances that they find themselves in.
Join us on Higher Listenings, because those who can make a difference teach.
But the situation in Germany is so bad. The exploitation is so bad. What our political enemies are doing to us, what the Jews are doing to us, the failures of the Weimar government. It's not just basic political incompetence. It borders on treason, how bad they are. It is this kind of passion that emerges only over the course of the speech that kind of sells the audience on the gravity of the situation and of the moment. We should note, too, that this style is very, very different from what most of the other people are doing out there when they give speeches. If you go and listen to, for example, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, talk, if you go and listen to someone like Winston Churchill, we tend to think of him as being a pretty good public speaker, they will put you to sleep. They drone on and on in almost a monotone voice like this. Sometimes they're just reading off a piece of paper. There is very little awareness in the 1920s and 30s especially of the importance of visuality. Before you have the radio, right, there are ways to record sounds and I guess spread them a little bit. You can go obviously and see somebody speak in public. But there's not like movies being made of people speaking. Certainly don't have the ability to just do like a home video. Right nowadays, we just get out our phone, we take a video of ourselves. Okay, how did I do? And so the power of Hitler isn't just that he's using this kind of emotional way of delivering the message, but it's also the failure of anybody else to do that. Most of the other speakers working this circuit, Gottfried Feder, if you like Gottfried Feder, you like him because of his ideas. You're not there because you're going to see a show, because he's going to inspire you. You know, you're not going to leave the meeting yelling and screaming about intra-slavery. But with Hitler, you do that, right? He works you up emotionally. There's a couple other things Hitler does to make himself into being such a powerful speaker. One of the things he does is he's very crafty about the words that he uses. I'm not going to get lost in highly technical jargon. I'm not going to go on about the discourse of the modalities or the subaltern or the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. I'm going to use simple words. I'm going to use words that are easy to define morally speaking. I'm not going to talk about invisible enemies or process. I'm going to give you a nice, clear minority group to go after, to envision as being the people responsible for everything bad that's happening, and that's going to be the Jews. Now, also to some extent, the communists as well. But he's going to speak in simple sentences people can understand. He's going to use emotional imagery. He's going to frame things in simplistic, black and white terms, victims and perpetrators. Germany is suffering. Who's to blame? And so he is able to create this very deep connection with his audience in a way that few other people could in this period. Now, there are some people who can on the German right in Bavaria in 1919, in 1920, but Hitler is one of the few people that can do it. By the early spring of 1920, the Nazi Party had started to grow fairly quickly. Hitler had become increasingly influential. He gets elevated to being the head of propaganda of the party, but he's still not yet the chairman. He's still not the guy in charge. He and Karl Harrer basically kind of butt heads, and he gets Harrer kind of to leave the party. Another thing they do is they start thinking about marketing, right? If we are trying to market our party to working class people, how can we most effectively do that? One of the things that they realize is you can't just be nationalist, because there's lots of nationalist parties out there. And so they decide they're going to change the name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or NSDAP. Now again, socialist here is a kind of marketing campaign. And what they mean by socialism may be a little bit different than what we think of when we look back on things. There are, of course, a couple of popular authors, some more honest about what they were doing, some less, who have tried to make the argument that, well, Nazis were really socialists, Nazis were really people of the left, and so if you're thinking about politics today in the 21st century, you need to think about socialists and social democrats as being closer to Nazis than conservatives on the right. This involves a couple of sort of historical sleights of hand. One of the things that it leaves out is that there is in the early 1920s, again, this group of people in the Nazi Party who think about socialism as being a good thing, or would define themselves in some ways as a kind of socialist. It leaves out that many of these people get eliminated, whether you're talking about politically before 1933 and the Nazi seizure of power, or whether you're talking about literally getting killed in 1934 during the night of the Long Knives, or the Röhm Purge, as it's sometimes called, or the Blood Purge. The Nazis deal with that more sort of pro-socialist element pretty harshly before a lot of things happened during World War II. They also tend to ignore a really key distinction that people like, for example, Gregor Strasser argued, which is that when they understand socialism, they are not embracing the idea of class warfare or of class conflict, which is so central to what people on the left are doing somewhat today, but especially back in the 19-teens and 1920s. These people are thinking about their socialism less as Marx and Lenin, who they tend to hate actually, and more of socialism being a synonym for radicalism. When we, the Nazi Party, look around at the world in 1920, 1921, we don't think about it as being politics as usual. We need to pass some laws, maybe make some changes here at the margins. Our selling point, our argument, is that this is an existential moment in time. This is an emergency. We have to take the gloves off. We have to do the things that are necessary to protect our people. And so when they talk about socialism, what they mean is basically radical social change to benefit working class people. It's not going to be class warfare. What's really going to happen is race warfare. But in terms of what they're trying to communicate to working class people, they want to show them that they embrace the idea of radical change. Let's move away from the politics of notables. Let's move away from only generals and aristocrats should be in charge of the country or the king. Right? We want some real fundamental change, and how we're going to sell that linguistically is by including socialist in the name of our party. Last thing I'll say too is it's very problematic to try to argue that political parties today are connected in some ways to the Nazis or the communists in the 20s. Right? These are historical movements. They evolve over time. There are a lot of circumstances that change, ways that they affect developments of ideas. So these kind of simplistic ideas are really problematic. And a lot of the people that make these arguments are oftentimes just doing it to express a current political point, and they're not looking at history objectively. Put that another way, they're looking at it like a lawyer, where you go and you select the 5 things that are going to make your case, and you don't worry about whether or not that actually reflects what happened, right? You're trying to win the argument. Okay, I kind of got sidetracked there, and I'm sorry about that. To go back to what we were talking about, however, in February of 1920, the Nazi Party announces a 25-point program that's going to represent the 3 main ideological pillars of the movement. On the one hand, you have this kind of strong or passionate nationalism. You have a rejection of the Versailles Treaty, and this idea that really what Germany should embrace is the kind of the Wilsonian idea of democracy, that all Germans living anywhere that they are in Europe should be part of this kind of greater Germany. So Austrians should be included, Sudeten Germans should be included. Obviously, Germans that are now living in what became Poland, they should be included. There's also a kind of racial pillar, and one of the things that they call for is the racialization of German citizenship. They want an end to immigration by what they would call non-Aryans. And finally, you do again have this kind of Feder-led sort of socialism, right? This idea that we're not going to reject capitalism completely, but we want to get rid of this idea of unearned income. We're going to basically stereotype a couple groups. We're going to go after them. We're going to say they're the ones that are creating profit from interest. They're the ones exploiting our people. And so what we need to do is to ban usury, ban those kind of exploitative practices. We need to, as we said, we're going to force people, or we're going to ban, if you want to put it that way, the idea that people are making money without intellectual or physical labor. Right? The idea that you're just sitting around making a lot of money off of people, we're going to do something about that. One of their chief targets, by the way, happens to be the department store. Now, there are department stores that are owned by lots of different people, but there were a couple of Jewish families in particular that owned department stores. And you basically had what maybe about 15, 20 years ago, what one would have called the Walmart phenomenon going on. Right? Walmart moves into your town. Walmart has economies of scale. Walmart's able to sell things for pretty cheap. And so they move into your town, and suddenly the local hardware store goes out of business. Suddenly, certain industries or certain, mom and pop shops, they were owned by just kind of an individual family. They can't possibly compete with Walmart, and so they go out of business. In the 1920s and 1930s, this is happening in Germany, but it's the department stores that are coming in, that are outselling everybody, that are putting, again, sort of local-owned places out of business. And so the Nazis begin to say, well, we're going to put restrictions on these department stores. We're going to prevent them from coming into your town and kind of destroying your livelihood. Another area that they talk about is war profiteers. We're all for defending the nation. We recognize that we need to make munitions. We need to make guns. We need to make, armaments. That's fine. But the idea that you're trying to make money off of a national emergency, that's not okay. That's not cool. And so the Nazis will basically put all 3 of these kind of ideas together in this 25-point program, and it marks an important point of evolution. But this isn't just a bunch of guys sitting around drinking beer talking about what they would do if they were in charge. They now have a program. You can know what to expect if you support or join the Nazi Party. So basically, by the time you get to the start of 1921, the Nazi Party is growing. They have Adolf Hitler, who is a dynamic speaker, who gets attention, who gets people to show up, and who actually kind of wins people to join the movement. You have, as we just talked about, this official party platform. They seem like they're serious. Any good political party worth its salt has to have a national congress, some kind of party day, some kind of political convention, right? So the Nazis begin to have all these things. And by the time you get to the middle of 1920, Hitler is speaking to audiences of about 5,000 to 6,000 people. It's a lot better than the 100 people that he started with, right? All this said, however, we don't want to overstate the growth of the party or its importance. There is still nothing, even in 1921, that suggests that the Nazis are going to be the ones who will destroy democracy in Germany. The party at this point only has about 2,000 official members by the start of 1921. Almost all of these people are located in Bavaria. It is a strong or emerging regional party, but it has almost no influence in the north, in the west, in the Rhineland. And so as a result, one of the things that begins to happen is guys like Drexler who want to grow the party. Drexler is still the chairman at this point. He says, look, how do we get bigger? We've got to merge with other existing organizations. Let's maybe merge with a regional party in the north. And if we do that, now we have regional influence and we become a national party. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but basically these efforts create this kind of leadership crisis within the Nazi party between Drexler and, of course, his star speaker, Adolf Hitler. Hitler is no dummy. Hitler realizes that if they merge, now he's going to be sort of medium-sized fish in a much larger pond. And so basically he kind of throws a fit. He rejects it. He says to Drexler, if you do this, then I quit the party. You can go join and I'll start a new party and I'll take my people, the ones that want to hear me speak, I'll take them with me. To make a long story short, Drexler basically backs down. In the summer of 1921, Hitler threatens to resign and Drexler says, okay, what do I have to do to get you back in the party? And Hitler says, I need the party chairmanship myself. I need to be in control. This is now my party. And so this is kind of a big milestone. Throughout his career, there were a number of people who thought that they could use Hitler, who thought that they could either control him, influence him. Of course, the most notorious is Franz von Papen, who's going to be the sort of ex-chancellor that kind of convinces Paul von Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as chancellor. Getting ahead of ourselves here in the story, but that's what's going to happen. So a lot of people thought they could control Hitler, and of course Hitler wants all the power for himself. And so in the summer of 1921, he becomes the chairman of the Nazi Party. Now, as this leadership fight is going on, Hitler is not opposed to growing the party, and he realizes the advantages of trying to combine forces. And so as long as he's allowed to sort of stay in a leadership position, he's totally fine with this and in some ways encourages it. And so at the same time that this leadership struggle is essentially playing out, the Nazi Party will make significant efforts to recruit new members from other organizations. One of the opportunities that presents itself in the summer of 1921 comes from the disbanding of the Freikorps. If you haven't listened to our previous episode where we talked about the Freikorps, these are basically kind of volunteer paramilitary units that kind of pop up after World War I. A number of them are ex-soldiers, veterans from World War I. They want to fight for the nation. They want to defend it from communism. They fight a little bit on the Eastern Front. They go up to Latvia, for example. They'll do some fighting there with the blessing of the Allies until they kind of turn out to be a big problem. And so in the summer of 1921, the German government's a little bit worried about it. They've obviously just made it through the Kapp Putsch, which was led by one of these Freikorps units. And so they say, okay, we're going to disband them. We're tired of them. These are sort of a threat. One of these units was led by a guy named Hermann Erhardt, who we talked about. He was one of the guys that led the Kapp Putsch. And as we mentioned, after the putsch is over, Erhardt is basically actually honorably discharged from the Navy. Eventually, there's an arrest warrant put out for him. So he kind of goes to Bavaria, where the authorities are kind of sympathetic to the leaders of the putsch. Erhardt will help found this thing called Organization Consul. Consul basically will carry out assassinations of leading Weimar politicians. But as he's there, Erhardt will come into contact with a former German army officer named Ernst Röhm. Röhm will recruit Erhardt and many of his Freikorps men, or former Freikorps men, to join the Sturmabteilung, or the SA, that we'll talk about more in a little bit. bringing in someone of Erhard's reputation to your movement, bringing in some of his leaders, bringing in some of his technical advisors, things like that, that is a really strong way to build your movement. That's a way to get notice and recognition from people who think highly of Erhard. And now Erhard is kind of giving up the kind of overt way of overthrowing the government. So now Erhard's going to, back the Nazi party. Okay, maybe these Nazis, maybe Hitler, maybe put the two of them together, maybe they represent the best future for Germany. Now, Erhard is an interesting fellow because, again, he's obviously very sort of right-wing nationalist, believed heavily in authoritarianism. But Erhard and Hitler don't really get along very well. And in fact, he'll leave the movement, he'll kind of distance himself from the Nazis only a couple months after first kind of coming into this association. In the mid-1920s, Erhard will actually lead the kind of right-wing opposition to Hitler and the Nazi Party. Now, after the seizure of power, they convince Erhard to join the SS, but basically he realizes that this isn't really, he's not really popular. They're kind of paying, an honor to him, but in the back of their minds, the Nazis don't trust him. And so as the Night of the Long Knives, as the Röhm Purge begins to unfold in the summer of 1934, Erhard will escape Germany. And from 1936 until his death in 1971, he basically is just a simple farmer, and he has nothing to do with politics. Now, before we move on, I want to talk a little bit more about Röhm, because Röhm is also a pretty significant figure in the story. So just to give you some backstory on him, Röhm was something of a soldier's soldier, right? He's this kind of gruff and direct guy who has little time for philosophy and formal politics. If Röhm was alive today, he would probably be pretty popular on social media. He would be giving a kind of manocast, or, he would be participating in the manosphere. He would be talking about, violence is a good thing, rough, no-nonsense persona. He would celebrate the notion of being a kind of hard man. I don't care about your feelings. I don't care about, the niceties. I don't get political correctness. I hate that stuff. Röhm literally begins his 1928 autobiography with the words, "I am a soldier." Right? So if you're thinking about his identity, the kind of marketing that he wants to do of himself, his self-image, it's all about being in the trenches. He later on says, quote, "The Germans have forgotten how to hate. Feminine complaining has taken the place of masculine hatred." Right? So he'd be one of these guys that's, working out all the time, showing off their guns, their abs, whatever, had 1,000 guns, that sort of thing. Now, one thing that's also interesting to note, and some of you may already know this about Röhm, is that despite this kind of uber masculinity, he was also relatively open about being homosexual. Sometimes you hear him described as being gay, but usually when we think about gay men, the assumption, the stereotype, is that gay men are very effeminate. This is absolutely not Ernst Röhm. Röhm is better understood as gay or homosexual in the Spartan sense, right? He's the guy that's I'm so manly that I can't ever be around women. At any rate, Röhm had originally joined the German army in 1906, so he was more of a regular soldier than that kind of group that volunteers in August of 1914. Röhm served with distinction as a company commander before being badly wounded at the Battle of Verdun in 1916. And so again, he's very patriotic, well, you were badly wounded. Well, that's okay. I'm still going to come back and do something. And so basically they put him behind a desk and he starts working on logistical issues for the army. And he starts displaying a considerable talent with logistical issues. And so when the war is over, he becomes this kind of liaison figure between some of these right-wing militias that are being formed with the idea that they're going to go fight the communists. The army likes what he's doing, and so they will give him weapons, and he will pass some of those weapons on to members of the paramilitary groups such as the SA. Now in 1919, again, right after kind of all this sort of revolutionary fervor hits Munich, Röhm meets Hitler. He is instantly won over by the future Führer's kind of politics, by his charm, by his speaking ability. He will soon join the early Nazi Party, and he will later play a pivotal role in building up the SA. Now, another example of this kind of Nazi ideal of recruiting was the induction of the racist publisher Julius Streicher into the movement. Now, Streicher is best known as the publisher of this heavily anti-Semitic newspaper. Oftentimes people refer to it as being pornographic because it is kind of using that kind of edginess, right? It has pornographic images, but not in a kind of like, if you've ever read Bild magazine in Germany, right? There's usually like a page 5 girl and she's just topless, and it's just to get people to buy the paper. They weave the nudity, they weave the sexual stuff, the pornography, if you will, into the images that they're showing people. So anyways, he founds this kind of rag called Der Stürmer, or the Stormer. And that's what he's best known for, that, and obviously becomes a defendant at the Nuremberg trials in 1945. Streicher, however, was also a World War I veteran who turned his hand to politics after World War I was over. By 1922, he had founded a German socialist party, and they had achieved a moderate level of success in Franconia, which is kind of like the northern edge of Bavaria. But Streicher is kind of pudgy. He doesn't really have a lot of charisma. And so in October of 1922, he and his followers will basically join the Nazi Party en masse. To give you an idea of how small the Nazi Party was, even as late as the fall of 1922, this doubles the membership totals, or nearly doubles the membership totals, almost overnight. Now again, when Streicher comes aboard, in contrast to the kind of Hitler-Drexler fight, Streicher is not saying, I'm your equal, let's have a merger, let's share power. Streicher is kind of saying, I'm going to be a disciple. Finally, we should also note the connections that Hitler began to develop by 1921-22 that go beyond the beer hall lecture circuit. One of the most important things he starts to do is to establish critical relationships with wealthier Germans who can contribute to the Nazi Party. Now, we should say, if you read socialist historiography about this, there's especially stuff that comes out of East Germany. There's a lot about how big business bankrolls the Nazis. The Nazis are basically just the extension of the bourgeoisie. And that's not quite accurate. Hitler will get, as we'll talk about in just a second, some funding from big businesses. But the thing that they really give him is less money, which most of it still comes from people basically paying their party dues. But what they will give him is respectability. The idea that Hitler isn't just some rabble-rouser, isn't just some guy from the street, from the men's home in Vienna. So among the most important of these early connections was a young German-American named Ernst Hanfstaengl. And Hitler basically meets him and befriends him in August of 1922. Hanfstaengl was basically this kind of wealthy socialite. He's been living in the United States for a couple of years. He comes back to Germany in the, again, early 1920s. He goes to see one of Hitler's speeches, and he's totally blown away by it. And the two basically become friends. Hitler likes that Putzi, as he calls him, he likes him because Putzi is giving him affection. Putzi is kind of supporting him. Putzi recognizes him as being this like, wow, you're a really cool guy. You're really amazing. We should all be supporting you. And Hitler, as we talked about in our episode on Making Hitler, Hitler is someone that always had these dreams of grandeur, but nobody really ever recognized him as such. Right? He was always the kind of dreamer that nobody was willing to invest in. And so here comes Hanfstaengl, who is from a wealthier, more aristocratic background. And Hanfstaengl is going to start opening doors for Hitler and introducing him to some of the more powerful people, such as publishers, businessmen, and army officers in Bavaria. One of the most significant people that he meets is a woman named Elsa Bruckmann. Bruckmann was the wife of a prominent publisher. This publisher was a kind of right-wing nationalist publisher. They had published Houston Stewart Chamberlain's highly racist Foundations of the 19th century. Another prominent group of supporters was the Bechstein family. The Bechstein family was responsible for basically manufacturing high-quality pianos. So Hitler gets to meet them, and they say, oh, Hitler, you're really into music, right? You really love Wagner. Guess what? We know the Wagners pretty well. Richard Wagner is dead by this point, but his son is there. His wife is still there. And so Hitler gets to meet the Wagner clan. In October 1923, he actually goes on a kind of pilgrimage to Bayreuth, which is where the Wagners live, where Wagner has this huge opera house that he built. There's the Bayreuth Festival every year. It's a huge, huge music production, center of German nationalism. He gets to go and meet all these famous members of the Wagner family. Now, it's kind of funny because Wagner's son meets him and is kind of Siegfried is like, I'm not so impressed with him. But his wife Winifred, who is actually English by birth, loves Hitler. And so they begin to support him and begin to support the Nazi Party. Now, again, would the Nazi Party have survived without the contributions of the Wagner family financially? Yeah, probably and pretty easily because, again, most of their money is actually coming from the members who are joining the Nazi Party and then also the SA. But think about the cultural credence that he gets from having the Wagner family say, yeah, you are somebody that we want to support. You are someone who is legitimate, who is a voice for protecting and defending and for having Germany be able to be reborn again. So again, the significance here is not financial necessarily, but it is more the idea that they transform this guy that lived in a men's home into someone who seems more like a respectable politician. Now, I noted in the introduction that a huge part of the Nazi Party's success was the way in which they created this sort of cultural movement that could complement or enhance the political ideas, the political vision that they were selling. And this was achieved primarily through the formation of the Sturmabteilung, or the SA. Now, later on, they get known as the Brown Shirts after 1924. Basically, this is because they start, wearing this kind of tan uniform. And they have the red armbands with the swastika on it. Before 1924, they don't really have the shirts yet, so they just put the armbands on. But the SA is usually referred to as being a kind of paramilitary, and it's also primarily viewed or discussed in terms of the idea of violence. It's not uncommon, for example, when you're reading to see historians refer to them as thugs. The image that we get of them are these kind of drunk, unemployed guys, manly men. What do? They kind of hang out, they cause trouble, they break stuff, they go harass the local Jewish establishments. We kind of see them as being rowdy and disorderly. And there is, of course, some truth to these ideas. The SA is pretty rowdy. The SA is a group that embraces the idea of violence, that celebrates the idea of violence. But the purpose of the SA and its broader function in terms of building up the Nazi movement goes past just this idea that, they carry out acts of violence. As Daniel Siemens has noted, violence was not only, quote, a means of behavior, but also was a core element of the party's propaganda, the socialization of its members, and finally, the establishment of a national socialist identity. To put this another way again, as I've talked about, fascism isn't just an intellectual movement, it is much more a movement of action or a movement of doing. And so if your whole selling point is we're not eggheads, we're not intellectuals, we're not, sitting around in the faculty lounge dreaming about things that can happen, which, by the way, I don't know about other universities, but I've never been at a university with a faculty lounge. I don't know that exists anymore. But basically where I'm going with this is if you claim that you are about doing things, that you are about exercising power and being masculine and embracing violence, then you need to practice violence. You need to perform violence in order to show your power and masculinity. If the movement is about the idea of rebuilding the nation around the frontline soldier, then you need to find ways to highlight the central role of veterans in that process. You need to find ways to show the people that the younger generations that have entered your movement, even though they weren't actually on the front lines during World War I, that they have imbibed and taken in and embraced those same principles. If your movement is about the promise of order, then you need to show people, not talk about, but show people ways that you are creating order. You can't just go around and talk like an ordinary politician and give speeches and talk about what laws you would change. you're going to be far more effective if you can show people that you are becoming the change that you want to see. Finally, of course, there are a wide variety of groups in Germany in the 1920s that are selling themselves as anti-Semitic. But if you're really anti-Semitic, if you're truly committed to it, don't you need to find ways for your members to take the fight to the quote-unquote Jews? Isn't the party that's going to attract people the party that seems to be doing something as opposed to the party that's talking about it? Moreover, before the Great Depression, the Nazi Party doesn't really have many seats in the federal parliament, in the Reichstag. They're not going to be able to drive legislation. They're not going to be able to propose things that are actually going to become law. And so in this early period of the Nazi Party, the SA becomes an institution through which the Nazis can allow people to become part of the movement. The Nazis can sell themselves. The Nazis can create something and establish their world in a way that isn't governed by formal politics. So again, before we get into the history of the SA here, it's worth noting that it was more than just the organization of Nazi thugs. It was, one could argue, one of the bedrock ways in which the early Nazi movement sold itself to the general public. And even though eventually it's going to be supplanted by the larger Nazi Party, and then also, and we'll talk about this later, the SS will come into being, and the SS will kind of steal the power of the SA, will take over its major role. The role of the SA in forming and confirming early Nazi values is absolutely critical. Okay, having said all that, let's get back to the actual history. Traditionally, historians date the beginning of the SA to the formation of what was called the Gymnastics and Sports Division of the Nazi Party in August of 1921. The reality on the ground is slightly more complicated. The real origins, you could argue, of the SA begin in that kind of moment in Munich in 1919, right? You have all these kind of small groups going around, not only communists, not only nationalists, you have Bavarian separatists, right? You have all these kind of people, and they just go to a beer hall and they give a speech, they interact with the crowd. And so it's not very hard to see that if you didn't like what someone was saying, you show up, you throw a beer mug at them, maybe you bring a couple of your buddies and you just break up the meeting. Right? I'm tired of listening to you talk about Bavarian separatism and the Wittelsbachs. Like, we're done with them. We got rid of them because they were losers. You prevent them from talking physically. As this begins to happen, most of the local parties begin to realize, well, if we don't want people to break up our meetings, we need some muscle of our own. And so actually the Social Democratic Party and other left-leaning parties begin to create these sort of divisions, these groups that are going to provide some muscle for them on the beer hall lecture circuit. Now, the Nazis see this and they say, well, okay, they're going to show up and break up our meetings potentially. Usually it's the other way around, but hey, they might do it to us. We're going to form our own group. Now, when the Nazis form their groups, they actually think about it in offensive terms. They create in 1920 this group called the Stoßtrupp. So these are kind of shock troops. These are guys that, small groups of like 4 or 5 guys. We're going to go send them into that meeting by that socialist that's speaking, and we're going to have them kind of interrupt and break things up. Sometimes they don't just go to meetings. Sometimes you just go to a restaurant. There's a restaurant of respectable people, of fancy types, and they think they're just, not suffering. They're not dealing with any of the effects of the war. Screw them. And you go into the restaurant and you just start shouting slogans. You go to a theater performance that you don't like. Maybe it's put on by a Jew. You yell insults in the middle of the play. You basically become sort of a disruptive agent. You become a jerk. And you perform your masculinity. Not all these things, by the way, are violent. Right? One of the things that the SA does, especially in the early years, right, when it's a small organization, is you try to find ways of doing this where you occupy this kind of gray area. Right? Is it illegal? Is it not illegal? Right? If I come into your theater, if I come into your restaurant, and I start yelling at you, right? If you want to use sports to make the metaphor seem a little bit more understandable, right? I'm a big Chicago Bears fan. If I go up to a Packers bar And I bring a couple of my guys with me, and they're big and, strong. And we go to this Packers bar, and we just start yelling Bears songs and saying, screw you, and all kinds of foul language. We just kind of break things up. Have we done something illegal? Are we really going to call the police out to deal with me? Are you going to throw me in jail, really? Just for yelling things? What if I was drunk and I'm just walking down the street and I'm obnoxious for like 10 minutes? The Nazis, and in the essay in particular, find these kind of gray areas where they can get away with it, where they can perform their masculinity, they can be disruptive, but they don't always end up going to jail, right? So the violence isn't always, street brawling, although there is some of that. But especially in this early period, it is more disruptive. It is more, again, kind of performing masculinity, performing power, than it is actually trying to assert it. To get back to the main narrative, in August 1921, this small organization, which has about 250 members, received a degree of professionalization, in part because of that merger that we talked about between Erhard and the Nazi Party. As part of the kind of merger arrangement, Erhard was able to appoint Julius Hans Ulrich Klinsch, a 23-year-old pastor's son who had participated in the Kapp Putsch, to basically kind of run it, to organize it, to structure it, and to build it into a real fighting group. Now, Klinsch began these efforts by targeting young men, mostly people between the ages of 17 and 24. He was pretty smart about what he was looking for, right? Again, I want to go after this generation of young men who lived through World War I, who understood the consequences, the stakes of it, the violence and brutality of it, who looked at that and said, I want some of that, but who never got the opportunity to do it. And so for many, again, this early generation of SA troops, a lot of the appeal is that you get to be a part of World War I in a way that you couldn't be because you were too young when it was actually going on, right? So it's not World War I anymore, but you're fighting for the nation and you get to do your part and you get to live that fantasy. Secondly, Klinsch was also aware that while young men may talk about action, not every teenager really wants to fight. Not every teenager really wants to be in the army. Right? When you go to basic training, especially if you're in something like the Marines or something higher up, basic training is not like summer camp. It's not fun. It's not meant to just be like, hey, let's go learn these skills. Let's go do some shooting. Right? There's a lot of life in the army that is hard. And especially, like, we're not talking about the modern army today, where most armies, the officers care about their troops. The officers, they understand the idea of discipline as not just being like you're going to beat your men or you're going to order your men to do things. But in this period, people are that way. In this period, officers really, really thought you can't let your men get away with anything or they might revolt, they might mutiny. We need strict and absolute discipline. And so as Klinsch is kind of thinking about what will the essay look like, he wants it to not just be about action and not just about even sort of militancy, but he also wants to promote the idea of fun. Now, that probably sounds pretty weird when you think about the SA. Fun, no, they're violent, right? They're thugs. But fun is a big part of what they do. If you read police reports, the police are, of course, spying on all the different groups that are in Munich at the time. The police talk about these meetings as being lively, as being fun. A lot of these evenings that they have together feature drinking and singing. There's a lot of hanging out. In short, a big part of the attraction of the SA is not just the street violence and the brawling and, hey, I get to wear a uniform, but a big part of it is about socialization. Being in the SA is a great way to meet like-minded people, people that share your values, people that share your enemies. It is a way to create manly friendships. Right? You're living in Munich after World War I. How do I get to know people? How do I make friends? I go to the pub. I hang out at the local pub, and now that we're politically on the same side, let's spend time together. Let's drink together. Let's complain about things together. Let's go get in a fight together. This, in many ways, replicates or tries to replicate the camaraderie that existed between soldiers on the front lines in World War I, which, as we've mentioned, many Germans walked away from thinking that's what we have to build the future Germany on. That's the pure, that's the tested, that's the uncorrupted German virtue that we need now. So how do we get more of it when there's not a war going on? Join the SA and you can get some of that. It may be helpful in this early period to think about the SA less as a militia and more as a kind of giant fraternity. Now, like all good fraternities, the SA develops a sense of rituals to reinforce the idea of collective belonging, to reinforce the values. It's not enough just to sit around and listen to Hitler talk. Fascism is a movement of action. Action means doing things. Young people like to do things. Young people don't want to sit around and be on a board and have a meeting. And did we get quorum? What are the bylaws? Young people want to go out and change the world. And so the SA began as early as 1922 to develop rituals of violence that would help them express and confirm their values. Just to give you a sense of what one of these rituals looked like, on August 15th, 1922, Clinch and a group of his SA men who are part of a bicycle troop, right? They like to ride bikes. They say, okay, it's a nice sunny day. It's a Sunday. Let's get on our bikes and let's ride out to the small town of Bad Tölz. Bad Tölz is about 50 kilometers south of Munich. It's a little town, little village. So they're going to bike out there. And then when they get there, they're going to go to the local tavern in the center of the town. And they're going to cover its entrance with a large Nazi flag. Now, at this point, someone tells the local police, hey, we got these Nazi guys here. The stormtroopers are here. Local police come out. They say, hey, guys, listen, you're on notice. You cannot attack anyone. If you do, we're going to crack heads. And the SA guys say, oh, we're not here to cause problems, officer. We're on our cycling trip. We're here to have fun. So they eat lunch at the pub. They have a couple pints of beer. They get their flag, and they go and parade through the center of town. And they sing songs, and they chant slogans. And the police kind of stand back and say, well, they're not really hurting anybody. They're just, good patriotic lads. They feel strongly. They're a little bit drunk. They're not hurting anybody. I'm not going to intervene. Let's let them do it. The parade ends at a place called the Park Hotel, which, not coincidentally, happens to be owned by someone who's Jewish. The Nazis stand outside the hotel. They start yelling at the patrons. They start yelling at the owner. Some of the patrons come out. There's kind of a confrontation between the SA men, some of the hotel's customers. And at this point, the police are like, well, we don't want any trouble, so now we're going to intervene. We're going to shut this thing down. The Nazis get sent back to Munich. There's an official complaint that's filed. But that's it. It's unclear if the police ever followed up on them when they got to Munich. And even if they did, Clinch is very kind of defiant about what's going to happen. He says to one of the policemen as they're leaving, quote, we have been frequently at the police. We're not afraid of it. And so the threat of punishment here, far from dissuading Clinch and the other SA guys not to do this anymore, it actually allows them to perform their masculinity. The police, the adults, the people in charge say, hey, you better not do this. And you get to say, I don't care what you tell me. I'm free. I can do what I want. I'm not afraid of you. And everybody gets to see Clinch and the other SA guys do this, and they get to see the SA acting out the role of power. These types of interactions continued on a weekly basis throughout the summer of 1922. Again, as Daniel Siemens has observed, they were ritual performances of violence designed to reinforce Nazi ideals about power and masculinity. The day at Bad Tölz, for example, began not with ideological indoctrination, not with yelling and screaming and shouting and punching people, but it began with physical exercise. Physical exercise is seen as a masculine trait, especially in the 1920s. It's seen as something that is healthy, that is about being strong. The ritual continued then with the symbolic occupation of the space in the center of the town. The Nazis don't legally take over the town yet, But by putting their big flag up on top of the tavern and by not having anyone force them to take it down, they are in effect declaring that this is our space. We own it. We can do what we want here. We don't have to listen to your laws. The drinking and the singing that we've talked about are related to sociability. They are a form of what many people, not just the SA, but many people on the outside would have said, well, this is natural, normal male bonding. In the 1920s, people don't get on Switch and play video games all day. What are young boys supposed to do? How are they supposed to be social? You go hang out with other young boys. You go exercise. Drink a couple beers. So for many people, as they're watching this SA ritual, they're thinking, these are just good, healthy, solid young German lads. Maybe I don't like their edginess. Maybe they get a little rowdy sometimes, but they mean well. They'll grow up one day. Finally, of course, the ritual ends with a confrontation with the Jews and their supporters. Now, nothing really happens. There's no violence. There's no, people dead in the street when this is over. But when they go back home, as they're, on their cycles, those SA guys are going to be talking about, man, we showed those Jews. Man, we showed those people that were, patronizing the restaurant. We did something about it. We don't just talk about not liking Jews. We did something about it. We're strong. We're powerful. We're changing the world. And again, to put all this together, if you're thinking about it from the perspective of those young, older teenagers, early 20-somethings, this whole thing is fun. Nobody died. Nobody came close to blows. There was no threat of really changing anyone's life or some kind of cost to this. The SA men, when they're doing this, by the way, they're not really even armed. They're not ready for a real fight. These are just boys. In many ways, it may be helpful to think about what the SA was in the early 1920s more as like a kind of West Side Story, like a gang, if you will, this kind of group of young men, and they hang out. They don't necessarily have something to do. They're kind of violent. They're kind of edgy. They're all kind of puffed up and pretending to be super masculine guys. But when you watch West Side Story, do you think, oh my God, these guys are all fascists? Oh my God, I hope the police come in and they arrest all of them. Or do you say this is just boys being boys? They're just, especially if you come from an earlier generation, right? When people just did this stuff and you got in a fight and it was just a fight. Right? When I was growing up, if you got in a fight, you didn't say, oh, I've been assaulted. I need to file a police report. Fights just happen. And that's the way that a lot of people, again, look at what's going on in the SA in the early 1920s. It's just patriotic boys being boys. If there's excess, it's not really something to get worked up about. And in fact, if you're a younger person, you look at them, they're having fun, they're doing something. You say, wow, so much in Weimar Germany sucks in 1922, 23. Maybe I will join the SA. Maybe that is a good way to spend my time, to do my part for the nation. Finally, one last sort of aspect of the SA that I want to emphasize here, and the way that it, again, wins people over to the Nazi Party, is that it provides them with experiences that can be used to create a mythology for the movement. For example, in November 1921, we're still at a very early phase in the sort of grand scheme of things here for the Nazi Party. A group of about 40 SA men are supposed to defend Hitler from a socialist group during a speech at the Hofbrauhaus. Now, the size of the socialist group is unclear. They were theoretically bigger than the Nazi group. It's hard to tell if this was an exaggeration from the beginning, or there was a kind of legitimate telling of it where there's about maybe 10 times as many socialist guys. Later on, it gets inflated to 20 times. Right? We have all these stories in history, David versus Goliath. How much was it David versus Goliath? Who really knows? But the story that is told is that this larger group of socialists show up. They're going to disrupt Hitler's speaking. And these 40 stormtrooper guys, they fight their butts off. They do so well. They show those socialists. And in 20 minutes, they've cleared the hall and defended it. And Hitler can go on and speak. Whether this stuff actually happened is irrelevant. What's important is that the Nazis took the story and turned it into a mythology and started talking about this is what SA guys do. This is what the Nazi Party is all about. Strength, duty, power. We're not here because saving the nation will be easy, but we're heroes and we overcome the odds. We overcome the challenges of the socialists who might seem like they're really strong, but when they come into contact with good, cold, hard German steel, we are going to win every time. Again, we've talked about the importance of the frontline soldier. These types of stories, the mythology, demonstrates the same type of resolution that the soldiers at the front line had during the war. We're overwhelmed. We're being attacked by the enemy at Verdun, at the Somme, at wherever. We're fighting back. We're holding strong. This is the virile, strong masculinity that the new Germany has to be founded on. And so these stories, I'm arguing, are critically effective in creating and affirming the Nazi sense of self. They are repeated over and over again in the party's press. They eventually end up developing these kind of annual commemorations. And the Nazis reinforce the idea of what it means to be a Nazi again and again in a way that sells that identity to people who are thinking about them. Over the course of time, more and more people will say, yeah, I want to be a part of this story. There's a kind of direct link here between hooliganism and this type of behavior that we're seeing from the SA, and you see it in other aspects and other conflicts in European history, most notably the breakup of Yugoslavia in 1992. One of the attractions to being a soccer hooligan is not that you're frustrated or mad about the world, but that you live your life and you want your life to be about a higher purpose than just, I woke up this morning and I had a bagel and then I went to work and then I came home and then I washed dishes and cleaned the floor and washed my clothes and went to bed. If that's all that you're doing with your life, then what the heck are you here for? What's the purpose of life? Part of the attraction to hooliganism is that you become part of something greater than yourself. You become about the group, you fight for the group, you're loyal to the group, you become a part of, again, something with a destiny, with a future. And when you're gone, maybe that group will remember you and honor the things you did for it. This is exactly what the Nazis are doing in the early 1920s. They are finding heroes and martyrs and stories and making legends to tell themselves, to inspire other people to perform those same values or to stay loyal to those same values. There are dozens and dozens of incidents where the Nazis do this. If you're interested in more, I'm not going to go into detail about them, but one is the death of a guy named Albert Leo Schlageter, who was executed in May 1923 by the French for basically carrying out sabotage operations in the Ruhr Valley. We talked at the start of this podcast about Horst Wessel. Horst Wessel gets turned into a Nazi martyr, and they tell his story again and again and again, and they use that symbol again to inspire others. Last one that we're going to talk about in just a few minutes is the Beer Hall Putsch in 1923. Not to give away too much about the ending, but it doesn't work out. There are a number of Nazis that are killed during the Beer Hall Putsch. These guys will be turned by the party into martyrs. These guys will be remembered throughout Nazi Germany as heroes who died for the cause, and their names will live forever. Or 12 years, right? Because that's how long the Third Reich actually lasted. One last point before we get to the Beer Hall Putsch. As we're talking about this idea of the growth of the Nazi Party, the development, the transformation of the Nazi Party, we need to realize, too, that at this point, fascism has not yet become a kind of formal political doctrine. Right? The idea of what it means to be fascist is something Mussolini is kind of working out in Italy. Others are kind of playing with elements of it, but it hasn't yet become a sort of thing in the way that communism or socialism was before it. And so basically, the next major step of development is going to be not in Germany itself, but in Italy, where in October 1922, Benito Mussolini and his black shirts will seize power. We did a whole podcast episode on this, so go back and check it out if you want the details. But to make a long story very short, basically, Mussolini is the first fascist to seize power. And so as a result, other kind of proto-fascists, other people that are kind of in that movement that are looking at that, they look and they say, what did you do that was successful? And we're going to start to ape, or we're going to try to copy some of those stylistic moves, some of those intellectual principles, some of those rituals and symbols. One of the things that they began doing is, okay, this worked for the Italians. We're going to start creating a cult of personality. We're going to start referring to the leader, not just by, Herr Hitler, but he's going to become the Führer. Now, this happened a little bit before October 1922, the idea of der Führer, but the idea becomes increasingly accepted not just as a particular title to Hitler, but like the bigger intellectual structural title for the leader of the movement. If you know anything about Italian fascism, you know, of course, that they are trying to kind of borrow from the Roman past. And so what do the Romans do? The Romans have lots of flags. Well, then the Italian fascists are going to have lots of flags. So then the German fascists are going to have lots of flags. And other fascist movements from across Europe are going to say, oh, well, we have lots of flags. The Italians had the black shirts. The Germans better have the brown shirts. The Italians have a special way of saluting each other. Well, then the Germans need a special salute. And so basically, when you put all these things together that we've been talking about, what we're seeing is the steady growth of the Nazi Party. By November of 1923, we have about 50 to 55,000 members. 15,000 of them are in the SA. And Hitler has become a major player in Bavarian politics. He is still not sort of nationally known as a figure that people would expect to take over Germany, but he is someone that people that are plotting to overthrow the Republic, they are thinking we need to include Hitler, we need to include the Nazis in these discussions, or we need to figure out how to use them to our advantage. Right? He's not just a nobody anymore. Now, as all these developments are taking place, the national political environment in 1923 becomes increasingly favorable for another attempt to overthrow the Weimar government. The trouble starts with the Versailles Treaty itself, which we'll talk about more in a future episode, but one of the things that the treaty required, as many of you know, is that they were supposed to pay reparations payments. The Allies say, Germany, you started the war, therefore you owe material damages to Belgium and to France for all of the damage that happened there. In 1921, the Allies established this total at 132 billion gold marks. It's about $605 billion at the time, which is a ton of money. At one point, the idea of when all this would be paid off was going to be 1988. So it's going to take generations of Germans to pay off this war debt. Now, of course, the war has just ended. We've had inflation. Things are kind of a mess in Germany. The Allies say, okay, you don't have to pay it all just with, money. You can pay it in kind. You can pay it in coal and lumber, and we'll put a fixed price on that, and we'll credit that towards your war debt. This is still a pretty heavy burden for the Germans to pay. And so basically in 1922, they began kind of intermittently defaulting on it. And in 1923, the French and the Belgians decide, look, you're doing this on purpose. We've had enough. We have to show you that we are going to enforce the Versailles Treaty. We're going to show you that all these provisions in there are for real. So therefore, they occupy the Rhineland and they start seizing these resources directly. Now, in the long run, this kind of has mixed sort of results. You think, oh, we're going to go take all these resources. That's going to be good for Belgium and France. But actually, the cost of the occupation kind of cancels out a lot of the money that they're able to kind of like take out of the German economy. In the long run, however, this moment of 1923 is going to be devastating for the Weimar Republic. For people living in Germany at the time, it is incredibly damaging from a psychological perspective. Germany seems to be a colonized power, right? Just a generation before, we were talking in Germany about, well, we're a world power now, and we need colonies, and we need to expand our colonies and settle our colonies and extract resources from our colonies, and nobody seemed to have much of a problem with this, or not most people. But flash forward 20 years and all of a sudden, Germany is the place being exploited. Germany is the place being occupied. Germany is the place having its resources seized and extracted by these foreigners. And so there is a real anger that is unleashed by the French occupation of the Ruhr, especially among the German right, but also kind of in the German middle. Of course, the other response to this comes from the German government, which says, well, we're not going to participate then. If you're going to steal all resources, all the coal that we're mining out of the ground, we're not going to mine the coal out of the ground. And so the German government will begin giving companies money not to fire the workers who are not working. They don't have any money to pay for it, and so how do they get the money? They print it. This leads to, of course, hyperinflation. Many of you are already familiar with the concept, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. When World War I started in 1914, the value of $1 was about 4 marks. By the time you get to January of 1923, instead of 4 marks, it's 18,000 marks. So World War I has some pretty significant inflation as well. By the time you get to August of 1923, so we're 8 months later, we've gone from 18,000 marks to the dollar to 98.8 million marks to the dollar. By September, things will accelerate, 25 billion marks to the dollar. By the time you get to August 1923, that number has increased to 4.6 million marks. The following month, 98.8 million marks. By October, we're up to 25 billion marks to the dollar. And finally, on the eve of the Beer Hall Putsch in November 1923, 4 trillion marks to the dollar. We went from 4 marks per dollar in 1914 to 4 trillion almost 10 years later. Imagine what that's going to do to your savings. Imagine you had money in your bank account, you had money saved up, you had a lot of money saved up because you weren't just, working class person trying to survive, trying to get by. You were some kind of entrepreneur. You started making money, and then it's all wiped out by hyperinflation. This has several kind of long-term consequences, not just for France and Britain and Belgium, but especially for Germans. It convinces many of the conservative Germans that the Weimar Republic is not strong enough to defend itself. This idea of democracy might be nice on paper, but in practice, it's not up to the challenges of the early 20th century. And so they will kind of lose their loyalty to it. They will say, okay, I'm going to tolerate it for right now, but if something better comes along, I'd be for that. I'd be up for that. The Nazis, of course, will use this to their advantage in terms of electoral posters and things like that. In particular, they focus a lot on the posting of African French colonial troops in the Rhineland. As always happens, when you have young men who are soldiers, who are away from their wives or girlfriends, or maybe they didn't have any to begin with, and you put them in a position of power with uniforms and some money and obviously steady rations, that's going to lead to relationships. Sometimes it's love, sometimes it's more, relationships of convenience. But there will be about 500 or 600 Afro-German children born in the immediate aftermath of the Rhineland occupation. And the Nazis seize upon this as like the ultimate sin of the Weimar Republic. How on earth are we having this racial mixing? If you're someone that you thought, I'm okay with different people, but they got to stick to their groups, the idea of miscegenation. This is a powerful, powerful way of provoking people, of provoking outrage in people, and it will help win the Nazi Party interest and ultimately votes. In this moment of crisis in 1923, as hyperinflation is happening, as the Ruhr is occupied, as anger is building among the German people, there are set in motion a number of plans to overthrow the Weimar Republic. And in many cases, the people doing the planning either are part of the army or they expect to rely on the army to carry out this kind of overthrow. People in especially the officer corps are very, very sympathetic to the idea of getting rid of this annoying republic with these civilians. Maybe we should have a monarchy. Maybe we should have a dictatorship. Hey, maybe we could bring Erich Ludendorff back into the scene. He kind of was one of the major players in Germany during the end of World War I. Maybe he should lead us back to glory. And so in Bavaria, they actually start sort of game planning some ideas out in terms of revolution. The leader of this was supposed to be General Erich Ludendorff. And Hitler is basically given a role in this process where they talk about him having a role as being the political leader of this uprising or the political leader of these paramilitary forces. Now, this planned revolt never actually takes place. When you get to the late summer of 1923, the ruling SPD government basically resigns. They were replaced by a sort of broad-based government, but the guy leading it is going to be a liberal nationalist named Gustav Stresemann. Now, Stresemann is not just a kind of, he's a liberal guy, he's a moderate, he's a squish. Stresemann was somebody with real credentials on the right. He was someone that ultimately proved to be loyal to the idea of the Weimar Republic, but he was someone that was thought of as being kind of a right-wing leader. Just to give you an idea of his mindset, when World War I breaks out, Stresemann was calling for annexations. Stresemann was a big supporter of World War I, saw it as a big moment for future national glory. Now, Stresemann was also somewhat of a pragmatist, and so as he comes to power, he realizes that this idea of passive resistance, this idea of just having people not work, and we're just going to pay them by printing money, this is not working, this is a disaster for Germany. And so basically, he ends this campaign and starts doing secret negotiations about, can we reduce this? Can we find ways to get around it, to make the burden less consequential for ordinary Germans? In time, Germany will sign a deal called the Dawes Agreement. This basically secures cheap loans from the United States. The Germans take the loans, they then use that to pay the French and the Belgians, and everybody wins. Right? The United States is making money off the loans, making interest money. Roaring Twenties begins. The Germans don't have to pay the French, most of the money that they're collecting from their own goods and services, and especially resources. Times are going to be pretty strong in Germany after 1924. Things will stabilize until 1929. And then, of course, the French and the Belgians are getting the money that they thought that they deserved. French and Belgian troops would withdraw from the Rhineland in 1925. And again, economically, politically, the Republic seems to stabilize. But in the winter of 1923, a lot of this is still in the future. In the immediate moment, plans to overthrow the government from both the political left and right accelerate. Now, the relationship between the Nazis, like Hitler, and the government in Bavaria gets to be kind of complicated. At times they're negotiating with each other. At times they're kind of plotting against each other. It's like they're ideologically similar enough that they're rivals and they don't want to let one win if the other's going to also win, right? So it's going to be mutually exclusive. Somebody has to win the kind of pre-race or pre-tournament, if you will, to see who's going to be the leader of the German right. And so there's this delicate game of cat and mouse, and when are we aligning and when are we opposed to each other? Basically, in the early winter of 1923, the Nazis start kicking around these ideas of their own coup. Hitler talks about, kind of seizing power for himself. And so to prevent a Nazi seizure of power, the minister-president of Bavaria, who at the time was a guy named Gustav Ritter von Kahr will basically ban the Nazi Party from having rallies. Now, Kahr was not loyal to the Republic either, as I said. He and some of his fellow travelers, a guy named Otto von Lossow, for example, who's the head of the Bavarian military, Hans Ritter von Seisser, who's the head of the Bavarian police force, these guys also want to overthrow the Berlin government. They're negotiating not just with the Nazi Party, but also with the Reichswehr, which was the German army. The leader of the German army at this point, Hans von Siegt. You might remember him from an earlier episode. We talked about von Siegt during the Kapp Putsch. Von Siegt said, when the Kapp Putsch starts and the Freikorps are marching on Berlin and they're going to take over, von Siegt says basically, no, the army's not getting involved here. We don't want to take a side. At this point, in November 1923, von Siegt is kind of on the fence about it, but finally says, you know what, we're not going to overthrow the government. We tried that with the Kapp Putsch, or we stood by when that happened with the Kapp Putsch. It's not legitimate. We're going to try to make changes, but let's do it behind the scenes. Let's not be so overt in kind of overthrowing the legal government. So you wind up by the early part of November 1923 with this real pressure from members of the SA, from members of other political parties in the ground in Munich, in other parts of Germany. The things seem to be falling apart. The time to kill democracy is now. Let's go. It's go time. And the leadership is kind of still unsure about it. So by, again, the start of November, Kahr and Hitler began to kind of turn on each other. Faced with mounting opposition from Kahr about his own attempts to potentially overthrow the government, Hitler and the other paramilitary leaders decided that they were going to back a putsch attempt by Ludendorff. And the date was set officially for November 9th because that was also the day that the Republic was declared. If you know anything about German history, November the 9th is the most important day in German history. It is also the date that Kristallnacht happens on. It is also the date that the Berlin Wall falls. So whatever you're doing, if you're in Germany on November 9th, have your emergency kit ready because things tend to happen. Now, adding to this opportunity, the triumvirate, Kahr, von Lasso, and Seisser, were all supposed to be at Munich's Bürgerbraukeller on the preceding night. And so Hitler gets the idea, if we can kind of occupy their meeting, if I can take them into a side room and I tell them that I'm going to overthrow the government, and I say, look, you either get with me now and you'll get rewards from it, or you're arrested and we're just going to sit you here and maybe we'll shoot you, then maybe I can kind of corral them to looking like they're behind my movement. And once we get the inertia going here in Bavaria, I'll be able to take over Germany. And so on the night of November 8th, 1923, members of the SA basically do this. They take over the beer hall. Hitler's running around, waving his pistol. It almost seems like something from Die Hard or a movie, right? The terrorists have taken over. Hitler tells the three that Ludendorff is going to take over the army and that the three men will be appointed to higher positions based on their support of the coup. The three men kind of go back and forth on it. They don't really want to support Hitler. They don't really see any alternative. They definitely don't want to get shot. And so eventually they're like, we're with you. We're on board. You can trust us. Hitler then left the Bürgerbraukeller to go meet up with Röhm. Röhm is trying to kind of pull off the rest of the coup in Munich, trying to seize various government buildings. The three men say, we would like to leave. Ludendorff says, did you swear that you're going to support the coup? Okay, I'm an officer. Some of you are officers. Some of you are nobles, right? I will trust you. Go ahead. You guys can go do what you want. And so, of course, as soon as they leave, the guy that was the head of the police, the guy that's the head of the local army, they call up their forces that are loyal. They say, there's a coup going on. We have to put this down. Let's arrest this Hitler guy. And so they immediately begin to rally forces against the coup. Again, I'm kind of simplifying things a little bit, but Hitler comes back. Hitler says, oh, what did you do? You let these three guys go. Well, that was a huge mistake. Now the coup is in trouble. And he gets together about 2,000 SA men, and they say they're going to go to the war ministry to try to link up with Röhm. And so as they are proceeding across Munich's Odeonsplatz, they encounter a line of loyal police officers who refuse to allow them passage. There are a few tense moments of confrontation. Somebody opens fire. And in the end, 14 marchers and 4 police officers were killed. Ironically, as this is all going on, they know who Erich Ludendorff is, right? He's got all his medals out. He's got his uniform on. Nobody stops Ludendorff. He just marches right past the police barricade on his own. However, the SA was not ready for violence, especially against the police that morning. And so the march kind of breaks up. Hitler runs away. There's kind of various fallouts from it. Some of you might be familiar with a guy named Hermann Göring. Göring actually gets wounded, and he starts taking morphine to deal with the pain from this wound. And this is why he gets to be so fat later on. Hitler will flee to Putzi Hanfstaengls. He hangs out there for 2 days before the authorities kind of put together where he is, and they will come and arrest him. Julius Streicher, Ernst Röhm, they were also part of this. They were also arrested, and then they would eventually be put on trial for treason. The Beer Hall Putsch, as it came to be known, should have ended Hitler's political career. Like Kapp and Ludwig from 3 years earlier, Hitler had committed high treason. And unlike them, they actually arrested Hitler right afterwards. Right? There wasn't this whole fleeing to Munich, fleeing to other places, hanging out, waiting till you got a general amnesty. The Nazi Party and the SA were officially banned in the aftermath by the Reich government. and Hitler was supposed to be prohibited from publicly speaking until 1927. And yet, not only do Hitler and the Nazis survive trying to overthrow the government, in the long run, you could argue that they benefited from it considerably. So, of course, the key question is why? Now, part of the answer lies in the post-war Bavarian political scene, which, as we've discussed, was dominated by nationalists who were hostile to the idea of the Republic. Over the course of the previous 3 years, they had been plotting alongside, or sometimes independently, of Hitler and the Nazi Party. They had, in some cases, armed and trained the very brown shirts who led the revolution. Their hands, as historian Ian Kershaw has put it, were certainly dirty, and they had every reason to take these things into consideration as they attempted to apply justice to Hitler. So we are talking about people here who are not there in positions of power, who look at Hitler and say, we have to defend the Republic. He is a clear threat to the Republic. Let us do something about him to eliminate that. But we are talking about people who had similar ideas, who, as they're thinking about the punishment for Hitler, are thinking, well, we want to be careful here how far we go because Hitler knows some pretty incriminating things about us. Or more genuinely, they may have just said, look, Hitler and the SA are extreme. They shouldn't have tried to overthrow the government. Some bad things happened. But they were good people, right? They were doing this because they loved Germany. They were doing it for patriotism. This republic is weak. Its leadership is weak. Maybe they tried to, kind of replace it the wrong way, but their heart was in the right place. Both of these traits combined with a lack of will from public authorities to make Hitler suffer the consequences of his actions, or rather not to suffer the consequences of his actions. Hitler's trial began on March 27, 1924, and the judge of the trial, a guy named Georg Neidhardt, was incredibly deferential to Hitler, was incredibly sympathetic to him. In fact, Neidhardt would later on join the Nazi Party, and as you might imagine, would have a career that would accelerate pretty quickly. Now, during the trial, Hitler is allowed to go on these long political rants rather than being forced by the judge to answer direct questions. Hitler is allowed to go on this big speech at one point saying, the real crime here is not what I did, but it's the German Revolution of 1918. That's the real crime. That's what we should all be talking about in this trial. The real crime here is the formation of a republic itself. How can something that is illegitimate be something you could commit treason towards? He further laid out some political philosophy. He said, look, people have natural rights, and these natural rights supersede any constitution. The things that I've done are legitimate because I wasn't doing them for myself. I wasn't trying to seize power for myself and enrich myself. I was doing it for Germany. I was doing it because the German people are suffering under the yoke of this republic. If you're listening to me here in the United States right now, you're pretty familiar with that argument. Nobody said, well, Thomas Jefferson and these guys, they're saying that they have the right to secede from Britain. Well, legally they don't. No one cares about that. I said, well, no, people have rights. You can't tax us without representing us. You can't treat us awfully. And so Hitler used a kind of democratic argument to argue that trying to get rid of the rule of law was legitimate. That the idea of using violence to kind of overthrow the Constitution, that in a democratic way that was legitimate. Now, the issues with the trial went further than this. Hitler got to appear in a suit. He got to wear his Iron Cross. So did Ludendorff. Ludendorff actually gets to arrive in a limousine to court. The court refers to him as Your Excellency because he's a general and he's a really big deal and he's a German war hero. At one point, the prosecutors tried to get deportation included in Hitler's sentence. Hey, this guy isn't German, he's Austrian. What the hell is he doing here? Trying to overthrow our government. Let's get him out of here. Just to give an idea of how sympathetic the court was to Hitler, not only did they rule that, this didn't apply, but they stated that we can't apply this to, quote, a man who thinks and feels as German as Hitler, who voluntarily served 4.5 years in the German army at war, who attained high military honors through outstanding bravery in the face of the enemy, was wounded, suffered other damage to his health, and was released from the military into control of the District Command Munich I, end quote. So you can already see how the court is sympathetic to Hitler. Again, that whole idea of like, this guy is a German hero. And what he was trying to do, whether it was legal or not, it was kind of the right thing. When the trial was over, Ludendorff was actually acquitted of committing treason. And apparently this actually pissed him off because he was like, well, no, I want to be, repressed by the Republic. I want to be a victim of the Republic so I can argue that I'm, the guy to lead the counter-revolution. Hitler and some of the other major defendants were sentenced with 5 years imprisonment, which they would serve in the fortress prison at Landsberg am Lech. Now, fortress prison, that sounds pretty bad, but in reality, it's kind of more like a version of house arrest. Prisoners at the fortress prison don't have to do any manual labor. They can receive as many visitors as they want, and in fact, for Hitler, this was actually a problem. So many people after the trial want to come and see him and pay homage to him and hang out with him. He has to start saying no. Over the course of his time that he was at the prison, he has over 500 people that come to visit in the course of a single year. He had members of the Nazi Party who voluntarily joined him in prison. People like Rudolf Hess that would help him write his memoir, his political testament, Mein Kampf. He has other people coming to help explain stuff to him that he can then put into Mein Kampf. The fate of some of the other participants also echoes this notion of a failure of justice, or if you want to put it differently, the idea that the rule of law is sacrosanct, that Lady Justice is blind, right? That's an American term, but the idea still makes sense in any democracy. Laws have to apply to everyone. The minute we start saying, well, some laws don't apply, or, the motivation matters, so we'll just kind of wink, wink, slap on the wrist, that becomes incredibly problematic. The ambivalent triumvirate that had ultimately crushed the coup, Kahr, von Lossow, and Seisser, were actually dismissed from their roles and replaced by a new cabinet led by Heinrich Held of the Bavarian People's Party. For Kahr, things would go from bad to worse. In 1934, he was actually murdered during the night of the Long Knives Purge, as Hitler sort of sought to get his revenge on a number of political enemies and rivals. Von Lossow would withdraw from public life. He died in 1938. And of the three, Seisser would actually have the longest career. Seisser would retire from the police in January of 1930, so before the Nazi seizure of power. He was arrested in 1933 and thrown into Dachau concentration camp, but he actually survived the war and was again briefly the police president of Munich immediately after liberation in 1945. The fate of the triumvirate, all of whom sort of suffered some kind of political consequence not for crushing the rebellion, but for basically being in a kind of compromised position, as some of the details came out, their fate stands in marked distinction to that of Hitler and Ludendorff, who prospered greatly from the debacle. Being acquitted, Ludendorff was able to run for election in the Reichstag, and he successfully held a seat from 1924 to 1928. Now, his political aspirations actually did kind of start to decline. He and Hitler had a very kind of love-hate relationship. They were sort of ideologically, on the same page. Ludendorff was very much into racism, very much into anti-Semitism, but they were kind of two kind of big fish that couldn't share power. And so basically Hitler kind of nudges Ludendorff to run for president in 1925. Ludendorff does terribly. And so part of the reason Hitler wanted him to run was to show him how little power he actually had on his own. Instead, Ludendorff eventually withdraws, and nationalists are looking for some sort of savior. Hitler can't run for election because he's just been accused of treason. He's just gotten out of jail. And so they settle upon Ludendorff's old colleague, Paul von Hindenburg. Hindenburg comes into the presidential election of 1925. He ends up winning against Wilhelm Marx. And Ludendorff understood this as a betrayal, because as soon as Hindenburg became the main leader of the kind of nationalist camp, then Ludendorff didn't really matter anymore. Ludendorff would withdraw from public life. He died in 1937. Incidentally, in the 4 years that the Nazis were in power, they tried to honor Ludendorff. They kind of used his ideas and his message and his image. Hitler kind of would show up at his house sometimes. I'm here to, pay homage to you, to greet you, to celebrate you. And Ludendorff is kind of like, go away. I don't want any part of this. I don't like you. So again, the two men had a kind of very complicated relationship. Finally, it's worth noting the value that the pause at Landsberg gave Hitler and his movement. By stepping out of the spotlight for a year, it gave him a chance to reflect on the successes and failures of the overall movement. And the most important failure Hitler began to realize was the coup itself. Like the cop putsch, the naked attempt to seize power, the violence made it easy for forces that were ambivalent about the Republic or who wished to defend the Republic. It made it easy for them to resist. Now, put it another way, it made it hard for the forces of order like the army that didn't like the Republic but didn't want chaos and violence. It made it hard for them to get behind this idea of a violent revolution. Above all else, while the army at this point, especially its leadership, very right-wing, very nationalistic, very much in the kind of we want some sort of dictatorship to come out of this. But above all else, the army still believed, especially in these ideas of loyalty and honor, and that you have this code and you live your life by this code. It's easy for the army to kind of say, well, we're going to stand back and we're not going to participate in something like the cop putsch. But it's much harder for them to say, well, we are going to actively play a role in this. We are going to be the ones that actually topple the government. And so as Hitler made the strategic decision to focus on seizing power legally in 1924-25, he essentially found a way to overthrow the Republic that would avoid this problem of resistance. He got released from prison in December 1924. He began to reform the Nazi Party to try to turn it into a powerful political rather than a military organization. And again, herein lies one of the most fundamental aspects of the entire story. The fact, again, that Hitler seized power legally. Incredibly, through everything that's going to take place over the course of the next 12 years of the podcast, from really 1933 to 45, all of this is legal. Now, Hitler was never elected to power by the German people. You hear this kind of colloquially sometimes. That's not true. It's myth. But his appointment as chancellor was completely legal. He did not seize dictatorial powers on his own. That was voted to him by the German Reichstag, including members of most of the parties outside of the Social Democratic Party and the Communists. Unlike most revolutions, the Weimar Constitution is never ejected or discarded. It gets displaced in some ways, but there's never a moment when they rip it up and say, oh, here's something new. It all kind of technically, legally happened under the Weimar Constitution. Again, recognizing the legality of the Nazi Revolution is a really key point because it's hard for the forces of order to oppose. If I believe in the fundamental value of law, how can I be someone that breaks the law? How do I decide that the orders and institutions that I was supposed to be defending are no longer valid, especially when I claim to be the guy who's defending those institutions? This was a problem that neither the communists, nor the socialists, nor the other parties could ultimately solve. Before they could muster a response, Hitler and the Nazi Party had swept away all remnants of the old political order, building a powerful totalitarian dictatorship. The more detailed story of how Hitler and the Nazis did this after 1925 is still to come. But before we get there, we need to give you an overview of the rest of the history of the Weimar Republic, especially before the Great Depression. And so this will be the subject of our next podcast. This is going to be it for now. Thank you as always for listening. If you've enjoyed what you've heard or you found it useful, please like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. Tell your friends about it on social media, or you can drop a positive rating on Apple and Spotify. These recommendations, of course, really help with the algorithms, and so the more that people are doing that, then the more people will find this episode and they'll learn about the actual history of Nazi Germany rather than kind of exaggerated or mythological versions of it that sometimes you hear out there. At any rate, thank you again for listening and for your support. We hope you'll join us next time as we take history off the page.